We're going to continue with our next speaker, speaking about e-commerce infrastructure 2022, evolving performance, security, and reliability expectations. We have Robert Rand from JetRails about to join us. And if you don't know who JetRails is, it's one of your hosting partners providing the fastest, fully managed e-commerce deployments for Magento open source, Adobe Commerce, Shopware in the Amazon Web Services cloud, and on dedicated servers. Robert became well known in the industry as the CTO of Rand Marketing, where he helped merchants thrive in e-commerce. He now heads up alliances at JetRails, an e-commerce hosting provider. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a nice warm welcome to Robert Rand from JetRails.
Hi, everyone. Well, I'm really up here because it's not an e-commerce event until there's a nerd up on stage. So glad to have you all with us here today, and very glad to be here myself. So, I'm going to be talking about infrastructure, and that's an arena that not everyone in this room is probably thinking all that much about on a day-to-day basis. But there's a lot that is happening, whether it's security, whether it's speed, and we've been hearing already today a lot about customer expectations and customer experience. No one wants to hit errors on a site. No one wants downtime. No one wants slowness or latency experiences. And so I'm going to be diving in, looking at that through a number of different lenses, including a lot of things that don't really relate to websites that need web hosting or to the web hosting itself, but just looking at how do we meet customers today where they expect to be met. And overall, the table stakes have changed. So I thought we could open up just, thinking a little bit about, where things started and how much it's evolved. Because there was a time when you could throw anything up there, and people were were glad to have somewhere to start. They were glad to have the overall experience that we are in constant flux, and the industry is constantly changing under us. So to start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the security side of things, because that's always, I think, that's what makes a lot of the headlines. That's what can really do a lot of damage also. And there's often things happening that we don't know or we don't think about on a day-to-day basis. So let's start off talking a little bit about fraudulent orders. Show of hands, who thinks that during the pandemic that the percentages of fraudulent orders went up, that the numbers got worse? Yeah, most of the room. Anybody think that they went down? No one. So interestingly enough, if we look at the data, and now I know that we've got some folks from Signified in the room that really have a lot of expertise in this particular space, but I asked my friends at ClearSale, and based on their data, actually the percentages of fraud have gone down. Now, this for me, as a data nerd, is a little bit of a look at correlation versus causation and what's actually happening in the numbers. So part of what's happened, as you've heard and a lot of you have experienced, the overall volume of e-commerce orders have gone up significantly. And what we're seeing potentially is that the fraud didn't go away, it just didn't grow at the same pace. So the same fraud challenges, by and large, are still out there. They're just not necessarily growing exponentially, which is a good thing, and something that I'm certainly very glad to hear. We are seeing some challenges arise that existed before, but in terms of trend lines, we've been seeing gift cards being part of those attack vectors more often now. So I actually know a merchant that last year lost tens of thousands of dollars because their gift cards were abused. And by the time that they caught on to it, because that wasn't going through their normal fraud filters and things, that they're just gift card numbers that are accepted through their checkout, a lot of orders had shipped. And so a lot of damage was done. But if you think about it, even if you're selling more generic cards, there are cases where you might otherwise get to go through a more traditional checkout process and have some time before you ship the order, even if it's a few hours, to catch on to fraud, when there are gift cards involved, it gets a little messier. So there are a lot of different nuances of how these attacks happen and what types of stores and what types of gift cards, but it's an interesting trend line. We're also, of course, seeing a lot more attacks involve bots. You're going to hear a lot about bots from me today. There are good ones out there. That Google's crawling your website to help get you indexed in their search engines. There's lots of good things happening from bots, but bots also cause a lot of trouble. And so one typical attack that we see often now, it's called a carding attack, where a list of stolen credit cards and debit cards is run against your checkout, trying to find ones that are working and order goods. And so those sorts of things are happening more commonly, and without the right systems, the right payment gateways, the right fraud prevention tools, we're seeing a lot. We're also seeing a lot of interesting conversations around personal identifying information. PII is something that, it's really started in the conversations around laws like GDPR. By the way, does anybody know which one of these is fake? Can anybody guess? Anyone have a guess? Virginia. Yeah. I couldn't believe that someone actually named one of these CPA. They're all real, but I got you to look away from your screens for a minute, so that was great. What we're seeing on this map is that different legislatures around the country, they are passing laws. They are working toward catching up. And so states like California were leaders in providing this kind of protection for consumers to make sure that we as businesses are protecting their data, that we're keeping it secure. And so there are components of some of these laws, like in Europe, GDPR, the right to be forgotten, the right to know what data they're storing, et cetera. But from a security standpoint, what we're seeing is that PCI compliance was the gold standard in e-commerce. Not perfect, but at least set that really important standard from the payment card industry to say if you're going to accept credit cards, if you're going to accept debit cards, you have to have a certain basis of security in place at all times, and you're responsible for it. And there are issues that you're going to run into if there is fraud, if there is theft of the credit card data, and you weren't doing your job. So what we're now seeing is that both individuals and states can also go after you. So this is making it more and more important to really think about what data you're collecting, where you're storing it, who else is getting access to it. And in a lot of cases, that comes down to a supply chain. It's not just you and your employees. So what we're looking at actively is how many integrations you have and what data they're getting access to. If I had to guess, most people in this room that are actively running e-commerce businesses that have been up and running for a few years, you're probably in some cases using dozens of apps that get API access, that are otherwise exposed through the website, through JavaScript and other coding. And so in a lot of cases, the security threats aren't necessarily about what your developer did on your website or something like a more direct threat, but it's what's going on behind the scenes. It's what apps are you using and what's their security like. And in a lot of cases, there are one-off issues. I've got up here, there were some Shopify employees stealing data. I'm actually very glad to see that that the FBI was brought in, that was dealt with really swiftly, and so there are those sorts of cases where it's caught. But then there are other cases where we wind up with software that's in the stack, software that's exposed. And so a while back, we all heard in the news about SolarWinds, company that was supplying software and services to any number of tech companies, any number of major organizations. And that through a long-term hack, that exposed a lot of data. It exposed a lot of businesses and organizations. And so recently, the bigger news item, last year, the worst security incident, out there was Log4j, that Log4Shell. While that may not impact your websites as directly in some cases, and even open source platforms like Magento or WooCommerce or Shopware might not be as directly impacted, but in a lot of cases, things running behind the scenes are. And so if you're using third parties that aren't necessarily providing that level of security, your data could be out there. And so we find that there are services like Elasticsearch and cPanel and all sorts of things that are in the stack that a lot of these companies are using that can be susceptible to these sorts of things. So it becomes important to think about who's in the stack. Now, I'm going to switch back to bots for a moment. Because in a lot of cases, the bots are the devices being used, are the mechanism for finding the weak servers and the weak websites. It's not just somebody sitting at a computer and plugging away all day looking to try to find a weak website. They just set up their scripts and they scour the internet. They have their bots checking site after site, looking for these weak apps and extensions and plugins and modules and other add-ons, as well as weaknesses in the site coding itself and things of that nature. And so, the bots have really grown in what they're doing out there. Now, there are a bunch of different reasons that bots are hitting your site. Some of them are scrapers. They're checking your product prices because your competitors want to make sure that they price their products just under yours. Or that if your products go out of stock, that they up the price on their site because, hey, they're the only ones in town that have the product left. So there are a lot of reasons why this is hitting your website, but my friends at Perimeter X, based on their data, we're seeing that about half of traffic, and this is an average, so site to site, of course, going to be different, but about half of traffic is coming from these bots for one reason or another. And so a huge amount of your resources is actually going to serving these. It can lead to slowdowns of websites. It can lead to lost revenue. There's a lot that's happening. It can really throw off your analytics, make your conversion rates and other things look worse. And one of the interesting things, so as I was preparing for this and chatting with my friends at Perimeter X, they shared this video with me. I don't know if we've got the audio for it, but I'm gonna let a little bit of it play if it'll go.
Before the video begins, I want to give a shout out to my boy Boomstick. Yeah, he plugged it with Cold Eye Feathers release, and it was a good experience of me running it. Also, another question I wanted to ask you guys is if you want a tutorial on how to hit Shopify. I've been hitting Shopify a lot recently, and maybe you guys want to know some tips or tricks on how to cook Shopify. Even though I get like 1 and 2 pairs, something is something for me. So if you want to know how to hit Kith, Undefeated, and other sites like that, I can teach you guys, give you some tips,
This is up on YouTube.
So if you guys want that, just leave a like.
We're playing this live from YouTube.
Once again, go check out Boomstick, and I hope you guys enjoy the video.
Running my main manual. What's that?
Our site's already hiccuping.
Yeah, the site's already down.
How many seconds?
You guys are so low in delay.
Good luck, guys.
Yeah, exclusives is
page
down.
not found.
Yeah, exclusives is down.
So
Hello.
imagine you're selling a limited supply product or a new release, and you've got folks like this that are hanging out. It's a party. They are using bots to try to jump the line, grab up as much of the product as possible, whether they're going to resell it at a premium or whether they're just line cutting. And they're actual humans here, so they can click on the CAPTCHAs. That it's not completely automated; it's a hybrid. And so, what we're seeing is an overall, change in the landscape where, you really have to be a little bit more aware of what these bots are doing with your site, and in a lot of cases, deploying extra protection in order to stop them from hurting your bottom line. Whether that's frustrating your shoppers, tying up your resources, slowing down your site, all sorts of impacts. So, and along those lines, thinking about things that we don't always get into, you spend a lot of time perfecting your website, making sure that it's got a great user experience, making sure that it's fast, it's reliable, it's secure, it's scalable. But then we get to the real world and we come out of the vacuum where we all test our websites and make sure that they're operating well. Users, the actual consumers, the actual shoppers, are using different browsers like Google Chrome where they're adding different extensions. They're adding add-ons. Next thing you know, your beautiful user experience is chock full of other ads and other things popping up on your website, stealing away your customers, slowing down your site, ruining the great experience that you've built out, all that UI and UX work, really gets interrupted. And so now, while you might say, well, that's on the consumer, there are actually tools that'll help you to monitor which browser extensions are coming up a lot, help you to split test and see if you block those from running on your website, what's going to happen. And some of the interesting ones aren't necessarily the hijackers all the time. Sometimes it's browser extensions like the coupon extensions. So if anybody's ever used like the Capital One shopping app or Honey or any of these that basically when you get to the checkout offer you a coupon code. Well, as a merchant, if somebody was standing in your retail store handing out coupons that maybe were never intended for the general public, maybe they were just for your VIPs or for a one-time concession because somebody had a bad experience and you wanted to really take care of them, and now that coupon's being given out to everyone at the checkout, that can have an impact. It can have a real impact. So thinking about not just the internal forces, but the external forces that are impacting your site. Now, performance, as I've said, moving on from security, speed is huge, and I could wax philosophical about all the different studies that get into it, but I think that there's probably consensus in the room that the faster your website is, the better the conversion rates. It does go a little bit above and beyond, and like everything else in this conversation today, it's evolving. So it used to be that, of course, speed was important. Last year, Google rolled out Core Web Vitals. I imagine a lot of people in the room have come across it or aware. It's a new scorecard looking at not just the raw speed of the site, not just things like time to first byte, but looking at the actual user experience. When do things on the site as it's loading stop moving around so that they become clickable and properly usable? Trying to get rid of those frustrating experiences that shoppers have. Now, this does impact more than just conversions. Speed, it may not be the biggest factor in your SEO rankings, but it is a factor. It may not be the biggest factor in your Google ads, but speed has historically been understood to be part of your landing page score, your page score, your quality score that goes into the algorithm and determines where you're showing up at what price, et cetera. So there's a lot riding on it that goes above and beyond. And so now, coming back to these third parties, one of the areas that people don't often think about, they think about the theme. We see with platforms like Magento, people are moving on from the old 2015 base theme, Luma. They're moving on to new stuff like Hoova. They're moving on to progressive web apps. And that's great. And on the infrastructure side, of course, your web hosting, whether it's servers or cloud or whatever it may be, it's got to be super fast. Table stakes are more basic, but there's latency that's coming in from third parties. And so it's become more and more important to think about when you're considering adding that new app. It's that Marie Kondo effect. Does this give you joy? In this case, for this room, does it bring you value? And over time, is it still bringing you value? Because not only are there security implications, but it can be adding some lag. So actually, as you're adding new apps, testing them, seeing where they fit in, working to make sure that they're loading at the right place at the right time to keep the site loading fast, it is an important factor overall. Now, another area that we've seen come up a lot are certainly images, and that's not specifically new. And as the chart here, I haven't figured out exactly why there's that little dip in the chart, but basically what we're seeing is an overall growth in the payload, in the amount of file size that's being delivered from images, and that's a trend line. And as you continue to get more beautiful photos of your products and and such, and getting those up on the site, we don't expect that to change. We expect that trend line to overall to continue. So with that, it becomes important to think about, okay, are you optimizing the images before you upload them? Do you have an image optimization system in play? And if you really want to go to the nth degree with it, are you using a system like, I pulled Image Engine here as an example, a system that's going to serve up the right size image for the right size device and the right size browser every time so that you're serving up the exact minimum amount of file size for the most impact, so that instead of giving everyone the same thing, you're giving them what they need for actual success. Now, looking at another area that we see as up and coming, a little bit more underserved, when we think about the edge networks, we typically think about content delivery networks, which are baked into a lot of platforms. In a lot of cases, you might add something extra to get more performance, but that's typically for your static content, for content like images, which is easy to save and to serve from servers all over the world because, well, there's one image, that's one file. It's not particularly changing. That's the picture of that pair of shoes, and that's great. However, there's dynamic content on the page. There are things that are in flux. There are things that are not so easily cacheable on content delivery networks and these edge networks all over the globe. And so what we're seeing are bots, basically, that are it's heading toward artificial intelligence and new waves of tech that are simplifying the process of pulling together that dynamic content so that it can be served from the edge more successfully. And in a lot of cases, this is sort of the icing on the cake. If you can get a 10% speed improvement on your site, and that's going to generate a massive, let's say, I'm going to go with a 10% lift on conversions, it's a lot easier to increase your conversions in some of these cases by adding something pretty quickly and easily than it is to increase your top line revenue or bottom line revenue or anything in between by finding new merchants or new consumers. That marketing is absolutely always going to be crucial, but you want to make sure you're capturing as much of your audience as you can, and so speed certainly part of the conversation. And so up until now, I've mainly been talking about speed on your homepage, your product pages, your category pages, your search results, and your landing pages, and everything in between. We find that often it gets left behind in the checkout. And that's where some of the biggest friction is, that that's where people are second guessing whether they're going to make that purchase in that moment. That's where you really don't want to lose them because they've got intent. They've added to cart. So we have been seeing platforms like Bolt come around and really focus on that performance. Now, some of that is UI UX. Up on the screen, I picked a picture where instead of having to use the normal numeric keypad on the phone, that you're getting the numeric keypad that you'd use if you were dialing someone, right? Trying to make it easier for the consumer to get through the checkout faster. But some of it is just serving this up really fast. It is just based on the overall infrastructure and delivery. And now, reliability, I'm going to talk about very briefly, but and hopefully you're testing your websites and going through QA and making sure that there aren't errors or things getting in the way of your shoppers. And we've seen in the hosting world more and more talk about multi-cloud, using AWS, Google's cloud, Azure together. It's almost in some cases like using saying that you're going to get a fleet and you're going to have a Ferrari and a Bentley, and the parts are all very different. For your mechanics, not very easy. Adds a lot more friction. It's a big challenge. In a lot of cases, these clouds, they're built so that you can actually use a cloud like AWS, have users. Have accounts set up in different data centers in different parts of the country or the world, and so set up failovers that way using the same tech stack to keep it easier. But the weak link that we've seen is often that edge network. It's that content delivery network, that CDN. Those are tough to have a failover for, because first, figuring out when it's actually down is tough, because you're talking about servers all over the world. Well, if a few of the servers in the content delivery network are acting up in a certain region, or there's some kind of outage in a certain region, it's not global. And if you were just testing it, to see if it's down, if you're testing it from a region where it's still up, you would have no idea. And so what we've seen are providers that have been coming around that are actually monitoring CDNs all over the globe in order to be able to be that failover. And this is actually technically really challenging, not just because you have to observe what's up and what's down, but here in the e-commerce world, you still need to maintain PCI compliance. You need your web application firewalls and other things still running in many cases, and hopefully in all cases. You've got other things that are happening, and so having providers that are starting to come around that can replicate all of that and give you that backup so that when CloudFront or Cloudflare or Fastly or Akamai or whatever the providers are go down, you've now got something that you can fall back to. Now, I have talked about a bunch of things that are pretty forward-facing that might not be globally adopted at a high rate yet, but I did want to throw out a couple of more predictions before I wrap it up. Firstly, green infrastructure. Companies like Amazon have been throwing a ton of money at going green. And if anybody that follows anything that has to do with data centers and servers, even if it's things like crypto, takes a ton of computing power. It is not particularly environmentally friendly. Now, what they've been doing is moving on to a lot of green energy, working on, and these servers, because when you think about a whole data center, produce a massive amount of heat, need to really be cooled efficiently, and so there's a lot of water usage, a lot of other things. So they are actively, all the big companies are working really hard to address this. The reason that I think is interesting for this group is because we're expecting these companies to start giving out scorecards and to start basically telling you how green you are. And so if you're going up against companies that are very prominent in this space, think a company like Patagonia is going to be all over that. And so whether or not it's on your radar right now, think about your competitors and if this is going to be important to you and how you're going to address this with consumers moving forward, because consumer expectation, of course, is going to drive a lot of this. And once the clouds and folks start handing out these scorecards and such, table stakes change. The other thing that I think is interesting, I mentioned progressive web apps earlier. We are seeing a more diversified e-commerce experience out there where shoppers can shop wherever they are. They can shop right from an ad on a third-party website and have the order stream right into your site for fulfillment, and it's your customer. It's not very different than if you sell through Amazon and it's not your customer, it's Amazon's customer. But situations where, and I picked one here, an acquisition from Bolt. Tips are where they're making this more possible, and so really meeting the shopper where they are, keeping them in the moment. We see happening more, and from an infrastructure point of view, the expectation is that will over time take some of the traffic off of your main website. It'll potentially add more more usage of your APIs and such. And so we do expect to see evolution around that overall. So I know I've thrown a lot at you. If there are any questions, I don't know how much time I've left, but got about 5 minutes. So if anyone has any burning thoughts or anything, happy to dive in a little, and I'll be here rest of the day, certainly happy to chat one-on-one about anything in particular. I think I did a really great job. Everyone knows everything. This is great. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. One more time, Robert Rand, ladies and gentlemen.